The philosopher Dr. Cornel West says the decisive virtue that is needed in order to do this kind of philosophical reflection is the virtue of courage. We need to have and cultivate courage to shut down our devices, to turn off the smartphones, to turn off the television sets, all the modes of distraction, go into a room without any distraction, sit in a chair in the middle of the room. And this may be a practice daily for 10 minutes, just you. And then let's say when you're there, ask yourself maybe just 2 or 3 questions that you do every day. Maybe one of the questions could be something like this. Am I living currently a flourishing human life, the full human life? If not, why not?
Hello and welcome to the Explorations Podcast, conversations to unravel secrets to a life well lived. I'm your host, Lewis, and I'm joined by my wonderful co-hosts, Joe and Edwin. Joe, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to unravel secrets to a life well lived with you guys.
And Edwin, how are you? How's it going?
Doing okay, man. Secrets to the life. That's what I'm about right now. So let's do it.
Yeah, today we are, I guess, kind of shifting gears by looking back. And last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the latest innovations and technologies involving AI and the current state of affairs. And I'm excited to engage in a conversation that kind of takes a more big picture approach and looking at what are these secrets that we are constantly alluding to as far as a life well lived? Like, what does human flourishing and happiness look like? And I'm excited to have this conversation because I think that, especially with the news cycle as of lately, like it's almost like every hour there's some kind of change and innovation and a shift of things happening. And I think it would be great to just kind of have this discussion where we step outside of that just for a moment and kind of look back. And so to begin this conversation, we got to go to our resident philosopher, Dr. Joe, who really understands and really has a passion for looking at this bird's eye big picture view. And so, Joe, I guess my first question for you is, I've had many discussions and conversations with you, and we've constantly talked about this phrase of the good life and pursuing the good. My first part of my question is like, why is that so important to you personally? And also, like, how do we even begin to have this conversation, especially for the listener who's also like me, kind of caught up in the moment and the present? How do we even begin to unravel that conversation?
Yeah, no, to address the first question immediately, I think for me personally, it's so important because being human means being afforded the capacity to even ask the question and to pursue paths, pursue varying options. Whereas, let's say, as far as I can imagine, being a part of a different species, one is caught up in the matrix of the call and response of the fight and flight dynamic, and there isn't this sort of reciprocity with self and this kind of self-transcendence to which the penguin can ask the penguin self, what can I do today? Or am I living the best life, right? Despite the fact that we might imagine them doing that in a kind of Disneyfication of human animal imagination and a kind of all of that there. So being part of what we are means we can ask the question. And for me, that's very important then, therefore, to ask the question. I love the way you just began our conversation, though, juxtaposing the reality of a flourishing life or happy life and the novelty, the perpetual novelty we find ourselves in. New technologies, the news cycle, right? And the reason why I really love that sort of juxtaposition there, I don't know if you did that intentionally or not, is because there is a kind of refuge we can partake of in the perennially new and yet perennially ancient truths that are very much caught up in our very makeup, right? And it goes to show that despite novelty and newness of, let's say, technologies and other realities, there is something that anchors us and that grounds us. So I would encourage folks to, take the question itself seriously, because in one sense, we all do, but in an unreflective mode, right? All that we do because we think it will lead to the good life, right? The actions we
Mm.
produce, right? We may not be doing it reflective. We're going to say, well, what's going to produce the best kind of life? Or what is, even before that, what is the best life? What is the ideal life? What is the flourishing life? But when we pause to do that, we are then positioning ourselves to have a better handle on what I would submit is a critical inquiry for the human being. Right. So Socrates says it so beautifully, right? The unreflective life, the unexamined life is a life that's not worth living for the human.
Man, so how do we something I guess it was the cynic in me, like I was just thinking about folks or even myself at times, just speaking in the eye of like there's moments in which I kind of reject that notion or I feel like
Mm,
there isn't an importance to kind of have this big picture kind of view on the good life or even I don't know like I sometimes I wonder like what makes Socrates and
mhm.
Plato and Aristotle like why are those guys so important and how is this even relevant to what I got
Yeah.
going on right now? Can you speak into folks who are in survival mode at times or just caught up in the immediacy of life, is it still worth it to even take that step back? Like it almost feels like a luxury sometimes or like a privilege to
Yeah.
examine
Yeah.
one's life.
Right, well said. And it does appear counterintuitive, I think, especially for those who are caught up in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. One can say, I trying to put food on the table for my family. I'm just trying to breathe here. I don't have, as you put it, the luxury to take a step back and ask this question. I would submit that for persons who are caught up in that dynamic, it's all the more important, actually, even though it appears counterintuitive. It's all the more important to really ask that question. Why? Well, look, regardless, one is living life. And, one can live it in a way that is wise. One can live it in a way in which their decisions are leading to flourishing, a kind of maximization of their well being, or one can make poor choices. And if we ask, okay, well, choices are before us, we're always caught up in the matrix of choice dynamics. We then have to ask ourselves, okay, is there something more to making choices insofar as the choices will lead us towards certain ends? So if I'm caught up in the busyness of life, sure, it's hard to reflect at moments, but I would encourage a person in that space to, again, all the more carve out ruthlessly time and space in their schedule to really check in with themselves and to think and to use the resources that are given to us in our culture as a people to examine, listen, I'm struggling here. Is this the only option? What does that mean? Et cetera, et cetera. But of course, there's more to say about all that.
So last week, you mentioned like an exercise, kind
Hmm.
of taking a reflective space and just reflecting on one's life. Is
Hmm.
that all there is to it? Like, how does one even move forward? Like, what is step two of like, okay, I made this decision of I want to examine my life. I would like to pursue the good life. What is next for someone who maybe hasn't even engaged in that practice? Like how do we move forward and create progress in that
Yeah.
area?
Well, I think one would need to furnish themselves with varying resources, right? We ought to be discipled. We ought to be mentored. And, of course, we may not have the time or the money to get an actual mentor, but we can be mentored by books, by the writings of sages, by people who've, let's say, had the luxury to really sit and think about these things and have made real discoveries. So if we can turn to those sources, books and other um, ways of educating ourselves to help catalyze our own thinking about this topic, I think that's a really important first step. Of course, let's say I don't even have time to read a book. I can't pick up Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and begin to, right? Maybe there's a podcast that breaks it down. Maybe this, but is there something bite size, something that I can digest and think about? And of course, the answer, given 2025, given the proliferation of all the information that we have now, the answer is of course yes. But let's say you don't even want to do that. Okay, just stop. Ask yourself, what am I living for? Why am I here? Right? Okay, I'm working two jobs. Okay, I'm doing this. To what end? Right? What am I after? What brings me life? What causes me deep and abiding joy? When do I feel most alive? Why is that the case? Is it true? Am I deceiving myself, right? Again, counterintuitive to some extent is like, bro, who's going to ask that question, right? Because given the cultural milieu we find ourselves in, there is this kind of, this push towards, oh, just be practical, bro, make that money, da 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 da, right? No one's got time to sort of logic chop their own existential questions. But again, I'm going to say, no, that's really important because you could be living a life that in fact is misdirected. Now, of course, what's being said there is that there are objective truths, objective realities that are resonant with our own nature. And it's not this kind of infinite plasticity where it's just, oh, well, life is however way you make it. And maybe whatever's a flourishing for you might be different for someone else. And for at least the classical perspective, they're gonna flat out reject that. They're gonna say, yes, of course, there's some flexibility, right? One may be drawn to playing the violin, the other may be drawn to educating, the other may be drawn to leading organizations, and there's room there. But despite the plurality of options, there is a deeper resonance among those varying vocational experiences that can allow for the propagation and the actualization of a full and complete life. But again, right, all of that would need to be unpacked.
I want to bring Edwin into the conversation as far as the practicalities from a business standpoint, because I feel like there is odds of with when it comes to capitalism or even like the rat race that Joe was sort of alluding to. Is there a place for this kind of examination for someone who, let's say, has an entrepreneurial spirit, who like fully embraces the concept of flourishing in a capitalist society, and that is their pursuit, or someone who wants to be successful in the business sense? Like, are they at odds? Like, is the good life something independent of capitalism or the pursuit of business? Like, can you speak into that just from your experience, from your perspective, kind of to contrast Joe? Because I feel like Joe has such a strong like philosophical perspective on things, and I love how you can kind of keep us like grounded and rooted in the practical. Like, is there tension between the two? Like, what's your take on this conversation and discussion so far?
Yeah, I love the question, Lewis, because I think there is sort of this like false dichotomy, Joe alluded to, between the sort of this foundational, sort of philosophical outlook of what happiness is about and our day to day. And solving that sort of tension is probably key. So I'm going to start with a lot of what Joe said is foundational to even how I conduct my life in my search for happiness. The essence, I think, right, from you can't talk about capitalism without talking about money. And the reality is that when we examine ourselves in our lives, we have to examine our relationships with this sort of constructed entity that is so key to our lives, right? Why is money so important to us? And the answers obviously is because it allows us to get the things that we want into our lives, right? So then as you start to deconstruct that, I think it's really important to understand that there's so many studies out there that contrast folks who have millions or even billions of dollars and their happiness to those who don't. And the reality is, as they're the straight up reality, everyone says it, right? It's like, if I had $1 million, I'll be happy, right? I said it. There was a certain amount of money that I said when I was earlier in my life that I said, if I reach that, I would be happy. And I did reach it. And I can tell you that the sort of that happiness equation, it just sort of just balanced out. Now that said, there is, the research has also shown that there is this floor, right, where fundamentally you have to make enough to erase the anxiety and fears associated with finance, which is essentially tomorrow you want to be able to eat and have shelter. Those are things that fundamentally does help financially. And I don't think I've seen any evidence against that, right? Now, I think to Joe's point, there are strong psychological and philosophical interventions that let you like there's examples and histories of people doing that let you bypass that. And so we're not going to pretend that everyone is capable of doing that, but there are. But for the most part, I think we are all trying to solve that fundamental problem of like, let's feed and shelter ourselves and the people that we love. And what I would say is the problem with capitalism is that that fundamental anxiety sits with all of us because in essence, we don't control our destiny. So in capitalism, we gave up our ability to hunt and create our own food. We gave that up to the masses. Likewise with housing, we gave that up to the masses. So instead of being able to build a brick or wood home that you could say, you know what, I know how to do that. My great 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 grandfather knew how to do that, and I'm going to be able to protect my family accordingly by creating the shelter, like Lincoln in the wood type thing.
Right.
We now have the anxiety of, hey, if you don't pay tomorrow's rent,
Gonna get kicked out.
right?
You out, bro. You out.
You out. Right?
Right.
This is something fundamental that
Right.
fundamentally
Right.
different that is associated with the anxieties and fears that you're pointing towards, Lewis, right? In terms of our ability to be happy. Joe, I know you have lots of thoughts here in terms of what we can do in addition to recognizing this reality.
Yeah.
But the one thing I would add before we hear some of that is in business, I've learned the concept risk management. I'm going to get a little nerdy here. The
Do
concept
it,
of
bro.
risk
Do it.
management is ultimately the key from a practical perspective, which means if you understand the fear, the threat, the risk, you can mitigate for it. I'm going to use a quick example and pass it along, which is that if you're like there's this concept of career diversity or portfolio diversity I love, which is that if you fundamentally say, well, all of my money will come from this one job that I'm doing, all of your anxieties will in terms of money and your ability to shelter and food will come from that source. If you diversify that, if you're like, I'm doing this job and then I'm Ubering, that gives you a little bit more control, which is why I think Uber became popular, right? It's like, I have a little bit more control, right? And so that's diversification, right? The source of your income comes from various places. And I think entrepreneurship, going back to what you said, Lewis, is key to that. And it's going to become more important, as we talk about AI, it's going to become more important in the future. I'd love to hear what you have to say there, Joe,
No, I
because I
mean
think there's a lot
it's
there.
great. I loved what you just said, everything what you said, Edwin, but the phrase philosophical interventions,
Hmm.
which allow us to, or history perhaps is peppered with examples of folks who, through recourse to varying philosophical and spiritual interventions, allowed them to transcend the dynamics that you're speaking about very eloquently, Edwin, which is, if I could sum it up, the dynamics of finitude, right? Of limit, whether it be socioeconomic, whether it be political, whether it be health, right? We encounter a limit space. It's like, oh, right. And what naturally arises is anxiety, potentially even dread if there's no solution, no viable option, fear. And so then, and this is something that the ancients have wrestled with, right? Which is, are we simply fated to the fates, right? To certain limits that if they come our way, well, right, we're screwed, and therefore your happiness can be taken away. Or can we somehow navigate those very tight limiting spaces and perhaps even transcend them, and even perhaps find a deeper joy and happiness through that? Of course, different philosophical traditions will have differing responses also along with the spiritual traditions, but they are out there. And that for me is very exciting, right? That wait a minute, sure, let's say I have not diversified my portfolio. Let us say that my bread, for those of us who are urbanly challenged, that simply means money. If my bread is limited, my I just got fired.
Hmm.
What's going to happen? Well, perhaps there are other ways in which I can respond to the situation, right? Internally, internally, not by putting my head in the sand, as it were, but kind of shifting my perspective or having a deep reservoir of spiritual and philosophical resources that I can avail myself, so that I can then use this as a transformative experience to somehow transcend and move above and beyond. Listen, easier said than done, of course. Yes, easier if you're a bachelor, if you're single,
Right.
compared to when you have a kid at home or some children and family you're caring for, but it's still applicable. And that's exciting.
Yeah.
So, sorry, just a question I have here is like, does this start with recognizing one's own limits? Like, how do you even, does it start there?
Yeah, I think for some philosophical positions, the answer is immediately yes, right? So a Stoic will say, listen, hey, here's how you prepare for those limiting spaces. Practice certain imaginative and contemplative techniques that places you in those spaces. So imagine you being diagnosed with stage 4
Mhm.
cancer, or
Wow.
imagine you
Yeah.
actually losing your job. You get that slip tomorrow and that's it, your resources are cut dry. And sit in that space and allow the feelings to arise and respond, right? So the Stoic, right, is going to have a certain way of doing that by imaginatively placing themselves there. That's an example, right? There are other ways in which different philosophical and spiritual traditions will have recourse to their own tools.
Yeah, I was going to add, that was perfect, Lewis, because my thought was actually going to be framing it as a question to you, which is that, yeah, it's a thought of experiment that most people are sort of being challenged with today because of the reality of it, which is, would you would you rather be you today? And I'm asking you because you're a youngin, with knowing that you have so many years ahead of your life, you're healthy, you can jump on a plane, you can do the things that you can do. Or would you rather be yourself when you're 80, when you can't do the plane, but you have all the financial resources that you need, right? You have no concern, but you have X amount of time left on this earth. Who would you rather be? And the reality is, the way we act is that we act like we want to be the 80-year-old. And I'm wondering what's underneath all of that, right? In terms of anxiety, right? Would To Joe's point about the thought experiments, that's the one that I'm sort of curious about as I hit midlife here. It's starting to be clearer to me.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great thought experiment because even as you were kind of describing the hypothetical, I found myself wavering between the two options and considering them both. I guess it's the young in me that is leaning towards like being young with all this potential versus, I guess, being elderly and having a kind of security blanket, but with the impending like finitude kind of like right there. It's, I don't know, because I think I've had some experiences earlier in my life that just kind of reminded me that tomorrow is promised to no man, like
Mhm.
just this idea that there's no guarantees as far as our health and our life. But I do appreciate, like, especially recently, just kind of being more concerned and considerate about my physical health and my physical fitness and pushing my body to its limits. I feel just kind of thankful and grateful that I don't have a debilitating condition that limits my physicality. So I lean towards the just kind of this idea of being younger and having this potential of years ahead. But I mean, especially as of late too, like just kind of there's been days where I do kind of wake up feeling anxiety at like my current situation and what's going to happen tomorrow and just the precariousness of my situation and it almost kind of makes me forget about the things, the privilege that I do have, being at this age and being capable of doing things that I know I wouldn't be able to do um 20, 30 years from now. And I guess that's why it's this conversation in general, like I really kind of wrestle with it and I do kind of waver to thinking about the ancients, thinking about the past and what have past thinkers and schools of thought had to say about the situations we're in, and then I'll immediately go to the present and think like, well, they didn't have to deal with AI, they didn't have to deal with technology the way it is. But that's why I appreciate talking to you guys, and I'm wrestling with it, like even now as we speak, of like how do I properly manage that? Like how do I engage in the practical and the abstract to transcend the problems and issues that I face with today, you know? And how can I move beyond just the contemplation of it into action? Like how do I identify the best course of action for me to take, like past like reflection we've talked about, and it feels very important, like to just kind of, in my view, it sounds like it develops a kind of like a self-awareness, or it develops that kind of muscle. But I feel like there's a certain kind of action lacking in my life, and I wonder, for me and for the listener, like how can I individually identify and feel like, okay, this is the best choice for me to make, or this is the best possible choice for me to make, and to take that leap of faith to do something different in the pursuit of a good life. And so yeah, I was wondering if you guys have something to speak into for that, like some kind of principles or guidelines by which to help to identify those things, and to encourage me to do that leap of faith. Because I like the term leap of faith, because I feel like certain changes in action like require doing something that I haven't done before, you know, on a certain level, like, or doing something to a certain intensity that hasn't been done before, in order to kind of break through the various ceilings. So yeah, do you guys have anything to say in regards to that, like the decision making of pursuing the good life?
Absolutely. Look, I've been very blessed and fortunate to have had various kinds of academic training, right? As you guys know.
Mhm.
So, I'm a philosopher. I'm also a theologian, right? So to kind of set this up, we can imagine visually the distinction between the vertical, right, and the horizontal. So Charles Taylor, in his work The Secular Age, speaks of the modern man, modern postmodern person, for the most part living in what is called the immanent frame, which is
Mhm.
radically new in the history of humanity, right? That people essentially are caught up in the horizontal, right? And the vertical is always ever an afterthought, if at all. And the vertical here meaning the transcendent. So philosophy the world over can give us many answers that allow us to navigate or attempt to navigate the horizontal within that horizontal space. Maybe within the immanent frame, maybe not, but let's say within that horizontal. Religions, and here I speak, of course, as a Christian theologian, a Catholic, one doesn't, in that space, one is not limited to the horizontal, but also has recourse to the transcendent, to the vertical. And just like a GPS system, right, it works precisely because we have recourse to the vertical, right? We have satellites that then allow us to triangulate, and we can see above and beyond the immediacy of our limiting frame.
Mhm.
So if I'm going to go from Queens, New York to Brooklyn, New York, I get boom, put it in, I can see the traffic, but because of that verticality. If one wants to remain purely within the secular frame, in that immanent frame, and says, I don't know about God, spirituality, give me some tools, we can do that, right? I can furnish you with tools up the wazoo that could help, right? Or you could have recourse to the transcendent, which could allow you to see above and beyond. Now, of course, everything would need to be qualified. What does that even mean, et cetera, et cetera? But let's say we go with the vertical, right? Well, then that's where precisely you use the word, Lewis, but it would be used somewhat differently here, the word faith, right? Faith, as the old beautiful English translation in Hebrews chapter 11, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, right? How wild, right? The evidence of things not seen. Here we are in an empirically grounded world, right? Children of the Enlightenment. What do we say? We say, I'm only going to believe it when I see it.
Right.
And yet we have the audacious claim, the evidence of things not seen. And so then, right, we see that, wow, okay, then therefore faith can give me access to these spaces, to these arenas that de facto transcend the horizontal. So, oh my gosh, I got the cancer diagnosis. Oh my gosh, my child is not doing well. Oh my gosh, my marriage is falling apart. Oh my gosh, I just got fired, right? Whatever it is, boom, encountering the limit. I have now recourse to the vertical. I can then face the Goliath, the giant, head on, recognizing it's not even about me. I don't even have the resources. I can try, but I'm going to have recourse to the transcendent, to God. And now I'm able to see my imminent frame, my immediate limiting issue, the giant, not through the lens of my own finitude, but through the lens, let's say, of God, of the transcendent, which then amazingly takes the image of the Goliath and shrinks it down. It's like, what is that? Of course, here I'm referencing, right, Samuel and David and Goliath, the story, right? David is a little rugged boy. He's facing the giant of the Philistines, and he's bold with his little slingshot, right? Why? Because he has recourse to the transcendent. Meanwhile, the armies of Israel are cowering in their boots because they're like, yo, this is a giant, bro. There's no way. Right. And so these stories the world over, right, are showing us another way. I didn't, right. So obviously, what I'm doing there is laying out options without immediately giving you potential tools. Right. Like I said, I can give you tools within the horizontal. I can give you tools in the vertical. It's a matter of what you want. And that's, that's how it is. Again, I keep saying this, right? There's so much more to say, but
Love that, Joe. I think I would add a piece to that puzzle then, just as an example. You and I have had countless conversations about this. This concept of that we brought up throughout this episode in terms of finitude and your description of the vertical. It's helping me see some of the sort of how the practical fits into this, which is as sort of stepping stones towards that. For example, this practice of, even in Buddhist teachings, of thinking about death as in sort of oxymoronic way to understand happiness is one concept, right? In terms of what are you grateful for, which I know you mentioned before, Joe, in terms of as you wake up in the morning and you say to yourself, imagine, the visualization of not having any of this, only to open your eyes and see that you have so much. From a very practical perspective, these are stepping stones towards what Joe is referring to. And I would offer just one sort of more for those who are stuck on that sort of career financial sort of wall to that, right? Because all of these are, what Joe is talking about, this transcendence is extremely challenging because of the walls that we place around ourselves towards that. So this I'm very clear that our perception of finance and career is one of those walls. So how do you get beyond that? Peter Drucker, one of my favorite philosophers / management gurus, he probably was one of the first to bring philosophy into management. He had this concept of management by objectives, which is trying to understand your future. And trying to understand your future and writing it down, the visualization exercise, I think that helps you understand the finitudes and the sort of the constraints of. I love Joe's quote about understanding the material aspect of our lives. But if you sit down and you write literally, how old are you today? And then try to do it in 5 years increment. How, your age today, your age to, next year, and so on. So 5 years, whatever your age plus 5. At the end of that 5 years, what do you want to be true? Like realistically, right? Don't say like win the lotto, but like in the trajectory of your life, what is it that you want to be true? And you write those things down. And then what have you accomplished along those lines? Whether maybe you have a family, maybe you've purchased a home, whatever those things are. and then see what that looks like in sort of in each year. And then ask yourself or challenge yourself, is it enough? Right? Whatever that 5-year goal is like, okay, I've reached those 5-year goals. Is it enough? And here's the twist. If you're gone that year. So do that 5-year goal, the 5-year goals. Look at year 5, whatever you said you wanted to accomplish, and like, boom, you're gone. And you're now this is interweaving the eulogy practice, which is now you're doing your eulogy. Is it enough? Like whatever you've done in that year 5. And I think you'll find that that simple exercise helps you escape some of the wall that you've built around you, and it helps you along your search, because we're all searching. And what I very much appreciate about Joe is that his search, he has searched wide and far, which means that he's sort of, in a lot of what he's told us, he's leaving us breadcrumbs, right? And we need to go on that journey. And so I think we can help in this podcast, right, uncover how to make those steps, and we'll be there, right, to talk through it, to not only help our listeners but help each other, and definitely help in this sort of continuous process of uncovering what happiness is.
Just in closing in this conversation, I was wondering if you guys could somehow give us because when you mentioned like steps and breadcrumbs, it just kind of made me think about like the day to day, like how can we on a daily consider legacy or consider our finitude despite all the distractions that come our way. And I'm just kind of wrestling with that right now. And I wonder, like, in addition to these big picture exercises and practices, how can I like develop this habit to kind of consider and contemplate these things on the daily? How can I have that at the forefront of my mind so that I can develop better habits, make better choices in the pursuit of the good life? I was wondering if you guys could close out this conversation by offering any words of wisdom in that vein of just like considering the rat race of the day, so to speak.
Great question. I would really need to think about that. I'm just going to, a general sketch. The philosopher Dr. Cornel West says the decisive virtue that is needed in order to do this kind of philosophical reflection is the virtue of courage. We need to have and cultivate courage to shut down our devices, to turn off the smartphones, to turn off the television sets, all the modes of distraction, go into a room without any distraction, sit in the chair in the middle of the room. And this may be a practice daily for 10 minutes, just you. And then let's say when you're there, ask yourself maybe just 2 or 3 questions that you do every day. Maybe one of the questions could be something like this: am I living currently a flourishing human life, the full human life? If not, why not? Maybe another question would be something like, where am I going? To what end am I engaging in my activities? What is the goal? What is the goal? And doing that, I think, repetitively, right, by way of a habituation, day in and day out, what will begin to happen is you'll begin to carve out that inner space that is needed for the deeper reflection and the deeper grappling with these questions. It's slow work. It's laborious, but it's like sculpting in that sense. I've never sculpted before, but how I imagine or how I've encountered stories of sculptors like Michelangelo, you sit there and you're just chipping away. And over time, the entity comes forth, right? That's the work. So there's no pill. There's no, hey, download this ebook and read it, and then within 2 hours you'll have the answers to the questions implied in life itself. No, all of that is helpful, but the work is, I think, the slow, laborious, almost contemplative, monkish disposition daily.
Yeah, it is. It does. What you said, Joe, reflects a lot of the practices that I've seen great leaders take. We are our habits, right? Essentially. And what I've found, and even some of the coaching I've done with a lot of leaders, Lewis, is that the challenge is that courage. I love what Joe just said. That courage is actually the problem. you could always tell the issue with any particular management or leadership by one thing. I always ask them the same thing. How much time are you spending in the strategic versus the firefighting? And if they're like, oh, I'm not spending any time, I'm like, well, okay, I know what your problem is, right? The same is applicable here. It's like, how much time exactly what Joe is saying here? Like, how much time are you spending doing the thing that Joe is saying? Even if it sounds high level, even trying, like it's like exercise, like learning how to run, whatever it is. If you're not doing it, quite simply, that's the issue we should be talking about. Is that courage that he's talking about? Is like, why are you not courageous enough to spend the time? Right? Every great leader I've seen have purposely spent 20%, if not more, of their time on the contemplation piece of their work, on the strategic. They literally say, I'm going to spend this time, no one bothers me. It's on their calendar, on the contemplate, like every single day. And that habit is what built great strategy.
Yes.
And I assume will build great individual agency.
And just for our audience, right, to connect that word courage, for those of you who are watching or listening, it's like, okay, but how does courage exactly fit in there? The answer is this: I am a leader. I am afraid that if I don't busy myself putting out these fires, the fires will consume my organization.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If I'm afraid that if I don't focus on, let's say, if you are the leader of your home or whatever, right? If I don't do these practical, immediate things, it's not going to get done. No, you need courage to turn away from those things seasonally, periodically, in a disciplined mode, to now do the crafting for envisioning, for planning. And that matters. That does require courage. It's like, wait a minute, because again, pointing back to what you said, Lewis, it seems counterintuitive, right? It's like that's a luxury. I don't have the luxury to sit and craft my life vision. Okay, well then what you're saying is, right, you just want to remain in the fated disposition. You're just going to be putting out fires rather than going back to the drawing board and say, okay, wait a minute, why do these fires continually occur? Right? So that requires long-term vision, and that does require the element of virtue, the virtue of courage there.
Edwin and Joe, I want to thank you guys very much for encouraging me and encouraging the listener. And I want to thank the listener for even just kind of giving the time to hear this discussion about just unraveling the secrets to a good life. I think that the next time we have this conversation, I'll report back in on my experience of this exercise, because I think it's going to be very challenging for me, but I do feel very encouraged to exercise that muscle and to cultivate that habit. So I want to thank you guys yet again. Like, these conversations really mean a lot to me, and I'm sure the listener as well. So I look forward to these conversations, and just stay tuned to the listener for next week, because I think we're gonna go even deeper in this discussion.
Let's go.
So thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Lewis.
Peace.